So yes, I'm from Berlin. I teach product management, or rather I coach future product managers. And I want to talk about a social form that I observe quite a bit in that capacity, which is that of the startup. We have around 20 student-founded startups on campus, and we deal with quite a few external startup, what's called startup accelerators, that help startups to grow and to actually achieve their goals. So Berlin is, of course, in Germany, is this big startup hub, and so inevitably, when you're in this area, this is a social form that you just observe quite a bit. I want to start, though, with why, which is also the imperative of the field. Always start with why. So why do social form analysis? Why look at social forms using the calculus that we've been talking about here? And for me, the reason is that this form is operational, temporal, and relational, and it's all of this at once. So I'm going to employ the term whenever I draw a re-entry around these forms of unity of the difference, which is something that also goes back to Luhmann, which means, and I'm taking a very observer-centric perspective on this, that it is impossible to observe any of these areas without also observing the other. They always feed back into each other. And what I mean with this is the form allows me to observe an operational area of meaning. So what is actually happening? And my area, the system boundary under which I'm operating is communication. So what is actually happening on the level of communication in these social forms that I observe? They are temporal in the sense that whenever we draw this reentry, it's of course the endless expansion or contraction or differentiation also on the inside of these forms. So you could say, I could expand this without drawing the re-entry, obviously, by just writing operational and temporal on the outside again. So you never know exactly where you are, but that's exactly this creation of time. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. And they're relational in the sense also Dirk Becker talked about, that it's in drawing a distinction, the two sides of the distinction are also connected. And you can then ascribe different meanings to this connection. But they are always on these two sides, and then via the cross, you can then cross from one side to the other, obviously. But with this connection, you have to be very distinct then on what this connection means. And that's something that really recently I've been thinking a lot about when I looked at these social forms that I was analyzing. What does that cross actually mean? That connection actually mean? Now, when I say communication, and I said the operation being really this, like what is happening in communication. We go back to Luhmann. This is also where the unity of the difference comes from, where he defines communication as the unity of the difference of information, message, or what some have translated as utterance, and understanding. And then operation in society is the reproduction of this. But the reason why it's a unity of a difference is that this is already an observation of at least two observers. So there is some information that is encoded in a message, and that is offered up as a communicational element, a point in communication. But it doesn't necessarily need to be understood. I, as the observer, draw the distinction around this, that I take different points in communication and say this is something that one observer has a statement by one observer, and this is a statement by another observer, and they are connected in such a way that communication has taken place. And only as an observer can I draw that distinction. It's not the two observers that I'm connecting that are making this connection, but as an observer of these two statements, am I making that? And so in doing that, already time has passed, but not really passed, but rather been created in communication. And that's the communicational, or the time of communication and the operation in society. And when I say observer, I will talk about what I write into these spaces, often as areas of meaning, which means there are, an observer is drawing this distinction and thereby creating an area of meaning that they are separating from everything that is not this area of meaning. Very simple. That's the first order observation. And the second order observation, I mean, by doing this implicitly, I'm already observing an observer, but I can't write that out because I can only make this statement. But by doing this, writing this statement, I'm already writing this on a slide. I'm showing it here, bringing it up on a screen, which is already drawing another distinction around it, obviously. So when I make that explicit here, observer second degree, then I observe an observer. So I put another area of meaning around that, and I implicitly say I cannot observe the first area of meaning without also observing the second area of meaning, which is why I draw a re-entry. But I'm limited to making first order statements here in front of you. So that's why I can then draw another distinction that is not re-entered here. But of course, by saying that, I'm re-entering it right now, yet I'm drawing another distinction around it, which is this TV screen, this room, and so on and so forth. It just continues forever. So I can never really show you second order observation. And then also I want to lay out my analytical strategy. Like, what are the entities of analysis that I'm looking at when I'm observing the startup as a social form? And this is something I'm taking from Niels Åkerström Andersen, who has introduced this notion that whenever we work in an empirical way in social systems theory, we should talk about what is the grain of the analysis that we are really looking at. And for me, as I'm looking at the startup as an organization, this grain, this analytical unit is a decision. So making decisions in these different concatenated areas of meaning. And decisions are being made within decision horizons. So what can we pick from? So we can decide to teach, but if we decide to only teach nude, then that's probably not within the decision horizon that was offered by the institution that offered the teaching position. In order to change that, to make it okay, an acceptable decision to teach nude, actually the context of this institution would have to take the decision that it is okay, that they change the decision horizon so that I can then pick from that. And what makes this form operational? So I've been thinking about, well, if I look at operation, which is communication, the operation of communication, but I've chosen the analytical unit of decisions. What decisions are being made where? And decisions being made within an organizational context, and this can expand. This is also something taken from Dirk Becker's paper, The Form of the Firm, where, this is the operation within the firm or the organization. And I thought about, well, what is it if we are drawing out these social forms? And we've talked a little bit about reductors yesterday as well, and I have questions about reductors that maybe you all are going to be able to answer for me in the end. What is it that actually moves through this network? That's something that I found quite hard to define, because if decisions are happening in all of these individual areas of meaning, then it can't be the content, it can't be the decision itself that gets crossed, because what should happen at that cross? Maybe that decision could be negated. Okay. But then what is this other area of meaning going to do about it? And I'm going to dive into an example in a second. And then I essentially thought, well, what I'm trying to achieve is really come to an observation of an organization that tells me something about the state of the organization. That is the motivation behind it. That's why I'm actually doing it. For me, but also for the people inside that organization. This self-reference that also Dirk Becker was referencing. Teaching people a new perspective on the organization they are in. And then I said, well, actually the marked and unmarked state, how they differ is if an area of meaning in an organization, it's just my perspective on it, is unmarked, then it's trust as the baseline. Trust that this area of meaning, this operation can take decisions on its own. And I, as an observer, don't have to intervene. However, when that state marks itself, it means that all of a sudden decisions cannot be taken anymore, and there needs to be an intervention from a contextual perspective. So what I mean by that is that when a mark travels through this network, it creates a disturbance, and it can be in both ways. So if the operation sends out a mark, it creates a disturbance here, and vice versa. And that then is new information in this area of meaning. That area of meaning has to deal with it. And that can also potentially be seen as risk and reaction. So risk, that something happens, something gets marked as risky, and then a reaction. What do we do about that? How do we change the context in order to contain that risk or to actually get rid of it? Risk reduction, an important move within the social form of the startup as well. So how does, I quickly just want to go through how a form of the startup could be built up. And I'm just going to build this out. I'm actually going to take, I think that these forms can actually be built up from in different directions. You could start in the deepest space, you can start in the shallowest space, or you can start somewhere in the middle and actually grow it out both directions. I'm going to start in the shallowest spaces. So startup is always a part of society, an organization within society and within the realm of economic activity, from which we separate a new area of funding. There's something that we want to do, not necessarily that defined yet, but there is some funding, a potentiality for funding available. Then there are founders, and I thought about, well, couldn't there first be a vision? Couldn't there be founders that come kind of and take on a vision? And that certainly can be the case. So remember that this is my observation of a special form of a startup. Others could come to different conclusions, but in my observation, founders are actually the thing that comes first, and it's oftentimes something that is an area of funding that gets entrusted with in people. Constructions of people, of course. Construction that someone is a great founder for whatever reason. And then a vision. So this can also be, maybe this could also be, actually, this distinction could be erased in visionary founders potentially, but it's not necessarily true for everyone. And then dynamic capabilities, which is, well, in management kind of a concept. Of course, it's an old concept. You could go back to the viable system, Stafford Beer, probably. But here it means that they will build up capabilities in teams as a company, as an organization, that will be able to deal with different obstacles, different challenges from the outside. So not just this one-trick pony startup that we saw so many of during the late 90s and the early 2000s when we had these bubbles, but rather now what I observe is that oftentimes actually founders are looking to build up teams that they think can deal with a lot of different challenges. And then a scaling potential. So a startup has to be in an area where they can show that there is potentially great scaling ability to take over a big part of a market or create a new market. And then a problem-solution fit, so that they actually solve a real problem in the world. They have to show also some empirical footing that there is a real problem to which they have a solution. And finally, product-market fit, so that they could also productize this solution and build a business model around it that fits the market. And then I would say, and this is maybe a longer discussion for later on, that this could also, that in the organizations that I'm observing, these areas are creating such strong distinctions that the structure, the words are kind of variables, areas of meanings that can change, and it's easier to change them than to change the distinction structure. So if anything of that changes, if a founder pulls out, the organization is looking at this area of meaning as an empty space and is trying to fill it. And it's looking, the distinction doesn't go away, but the area of meaning goes away. And so this is not to say that the structure works without any variables filled in there, but that these distinctions can live on, even if they aren't filled. And then something more recently that I'm looking at is, what if the society is already the society that we observe in the context of building a startup, right? What if we want to change this and not just have the biggest revenue possibilities or the biggest scaling opportunities, but actually want to come to a resilient society, or a society that can deal with the challenges that we are facing, like a climate crisis and these things. And then to change this to having not just scaling potential, but to have actually societal impact. So society feeds back into this form twice. And this is something that I'm just currently trying out with my students. What do you do when you look at the energy consumption and the data distribution of the products that you're building? If you're feeding that into the form, but actually on the outside of your scaling potential, how does that change the view of the product? So not just to build a good or responsible product, but to actually embed these things into the vision and the organization. I'm saying that this is one and the same thing. Yeah. And then I want to end with a question for you, which I promised to give you on reductors. Question: could reductors be seen as machines of conceptual differentiation and generalization? I talked about this traveling of the mark, which could mean, hey, help, we cannot take decisions in this area of meaning. So thinking about the wagon wheels in the tunnel, I still imagine that somewhere in England, I don't know if someone knows, but somewhere in England, there probably at some abandoned tunnel, there still is this machine. Because I bring it up here because this is a conceptual machine. This can be read as a conceptual machine. The question it answers is it safe to enter the tunnel? And he built a machine to give that answer. And if we look at our networks and if we look at how marks travel through the form, then if we're asking the question, is my startup on the right track? Kind of also a train metaphor. And then we look at selections of support. Is there a connection? But of course here it's not just counting. It is counting as well. Like here it is counting of wagon wheels, and it's a very kind of almost a mechanistic view on creating this conceptual answer. Here the difference is that the areas of meaning that I've introduced all have their own observation. They can decide whether they want to count or not. They can observe that a mark is entering their area of meaning, but they can decide to suppress its further traveling through the form, or if they want it to travel further through the form. So if they can deal with the other area of meaning not being able to take a decision or not. And if they can't deal with it, then they could let it travel further, because then maybe another contextual area of meaning would be able to deal with it. And if not, well, then the whole startup might fail, and the startup might say, hey, the whole startup is not able to operate, i.e. taking decisions anymore. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Florian. I think deciding to focus on decision is the most important decision. I think it is absolutely critical in making this stuff real. I wonder if you can distinguish within your structures the difference between a good decision and a bad decision. We seem to be very good at bad decisions. And I don't know if you know the work, it's from the 1970s, the work of James March and Michael Cohen. What is it? Garbage can model of organizational decision making, where people basically sit around a boardroom table, they look at each other, and they know that they're facing with a very difficult problem, and they know all the political shenanigans behind each of the individuals together. Of course, their problem is to make it look as if they're making a decision to do something about this problem. And what they end up doing is ignoring the problem that needs to be solved, and they rummage around in the garbage can for an easy one that can be solved.
Yes. Yeah, and we, yesterday, I totally think, but what I think though is that this is then almost too neat of a model.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, and I totally think so, yes, because it's, what happens in that case, I would say, is that one area of meaning is not able to take a decision because of all these political shenanigans. And so rather they invent, maybe they could invent a quite complicated differentiation structure within this area of meaning to hide the fact that they're not taking
That's
a
what they
decision.
do. Yes.
Yes. And so then it would entirely be possible, and I would then imagine, I imagine these things as very dynamic forms anyway, that of course they're not synchronized in the sense that they're always taking a decision on a 5-minute rhythm or something like that, but it's a very, this is an abstraction in the sense that it is bringing something together and making something static that is very dynamic in reality. And so then I would imagine that in one of these areas actually there would be maybe a quite complicated differentiation structure implemented just to hide the fact that nothing is going on. So and if we were able to calculate this, maybe we would then be able to show that it all cancels out in the end.
Cohen and March are very clear that technology is one of the things that gets dragged out of the garbage can. And AI is very dangerous in this regard because it will be pulled out to solve everything and ignore the important problems.
Yeah, and also it can see through all garbage cans.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So, quick question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the other marks, having been to the Stafford Beer collection today, how exactly do you imagine this would change under a non-sort of global capitalist model of economic activity and founders and vision and all of those things that go into that? Would the model look fairly similar, just it would be sort of more egalitarian and state run, or can you imagine that it would have to, different systems of distinction would have to arrive?
Yeah, so the way I view this form, and you see there is kind of a break here in the middle. So the way I see this is that on this side of the form, we have the areas of meaning that we need to make the actual operation within the startup, which is on the left-hand side, possible. So this is kind of building up the potentialities, and then this is more or less realizing them. And I would imagine that this part could change quite a bit. And that's also something that I thought about when I said, well, when I change society with resilient society, because what does that mean, resilient society? Is that a goal that we can somehow bring to people founding a startup? Or is it rather something that, if it's a state-run thing that we just impose? And is there a real difference? Well, in operations there will be, for sure. But for now we could try to just have the goal of a resilient society rather than just having the free-for-all market capitalism society. But I could imagine though that, of course in societies where economic activity is not distinct from political activity, that distinction wouldn't be there, right? And similarly, if one needn't worry about founding or founders because they were state-run or whatever, then that distinction might not be there, but then there would probably be other distinctions there to mark the intricacies of state-run economics, which is also not a simple form for sure.
Thank you, Florian. I wonder whether you could make explicit the use of re-entries. I'm asking this question because I have the impression that somehow those re-entries are a different solution to Joao's problem of entangling and entanglement. You see, when you look at these forms you're drawing up, you see asymmetries symbolized and signified by the crosses, and you watch resymmetrizations when re-entering the distinctions into the form. And I'm wondering whether how you interpret this, and whether we could do without the tangles,
Yes.
but just looking more sharply at where and when and how re-entries are happening.
Yeah. Yes. So as I said before, for me they mean that none of the areas of meaning that they enclose can be observed without observing the distinctions to the others within that enclosure. So that's why I also said here, this is the realization, the actual operation of a startup, kind of really founded and operating with teams and so on and so forth. So so then I would say that it is this buildup fed back into itself, and what I mean with fed back into itself is also, like I said, these are not static states. These can be switched, so whenever this state marks itself with I cannot take a decision anymore, this state observes, like gets that moves into that area of meaning, and it observes that, and then can take the decision to suppress that or not. So, but with just one re-entry, I think it would still be a rather disentangled, not so entangled form. But of course, this realized potential operates in the context of an
That's
unrealized
right. So the
potential,
tangles, right.
a potential that could also lead to various different realizations that are different, and it needs to take that into account. So it cannot observe itself without also observing that the context could also realize a lot of other startups. It could also say, well, we just pull out, we just kill you, or you can continue, but we won't fund you anymore. Something like that. We would just realize something else, and it needs to take into account that it is operating under the conditions of economic activity. So it cannot be just unprofitable. Well, that's also a question. A startup can go quite a long way.
Can and will go.
Yes, but still it's economic activity, even if a startup only exists for the exit strategies of its founders, or if it's funding investors. Even if it's just about raising market valuation, it still needs to take that into account, and then whatever model of society it has in mind as a goal around building this startup has to take that into account as well. And so this creates quite a, if we take then these as dynamic forms and really think about wave trains going through them, then it creates, I imagine the point of re-entry as really the state from which where the different waves are fed back into, obviously, the form. And altogether it creates, I don't know if entanglement is then the right word, but whatever choice, whatever decision you take here means that it alters the wave pattern in ways that you can probably, you cannot necessarily foresee at that point in time. So it is definitely something that is not a trivial thing.
So there are a couple more questions, but maybe we can just take one more, considering time. So Walter?
Perhaps just a hint for your question for the network. Also, I don't believe that there will something like a magical problem solver for you using such a network, but I believe that your hint of the waves is a correct thing, and in your area there could be something like innovation cycles, warehouse cycles, and so on. So my opinion is that Spencer Brown gives you the idea that you can try to transform this kind of picture in another kind, like a network, where you study which kind of waves, as already mentioned, business cycles, innovation cycles, and so on happen. It's your need to develop this, and then you can look using that tool of networks what happens there.
Yes.
If there are which kind of switching elements there are, which kind of synchronization of different cycles and so on. Also I see not the ready solution, but only idea for you to go on.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I would think that it doesn't map necessarily directly to the to a more traditional notion of network, because it is rather really this contextual, because it's grounded in mutual observation, and that's something that we cannot just model that, like how these decisions will be taken. We don't know. So it's not something that necessarily is deterministic in the sense that we can really build this as a machine that counts wagon wheels. Because the machine, every time a wagon wheel, like simplified, every time a wagon wheel comes in, the machine could decide whether or not to accept this as a wagon wheel or not.
All right, I think we have to. There are two more burning questions, but just if you guys write those down, then is that all right? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Florian.
Thank you.